Paul, do you preach the health, wealth, and prosperity gospel? No. I preach Jesus Christ and Him raised from the dead. Paul, do you preach the motivation gospel about you becoming your best self and the best you can be? No, I preach Christ, buried and raised. Crucified, buried, and raised. This is my gospel. Well, Paul, do you preach a gospel that'll keep me on track and help me to be successful? I preach Christ, buried, raised from the dead. That's it. There's no other gospel because there's nothing else that meets man's greatest need. We're separated from God by our sin. Is there anything else we could preach that would do something about the sin that separates us from God? Motivation, self-help, prosperity, getting ahead, none of those things will get sinners into a right relationship with God. Jesus Christ, crucified, buried, and raised for the sins of the world. This is my gospel, Paul says. It's the gospel for which I am currently in chains. It's the gospel that he's not ashamed of. It's the gospel that he will preach everywhere he goes. And if that's not enough for them to get it, he then reminds them of something that they all know. And this is the gospel fleshed out just a little bit. Here is a trustworthy saying, verse 11 in the text. If we died with him, we will also live with him. The waters of baptism, I often say, we are buried with Christ in baptism. We are raised to walk in newness of life. Buried with Christ if we have died with Him. Certainly doesn't mean that we go to the cross physically, literally with Jesus. But His death becomes our death. Our old way of life has died with Him on the cross, and as He is raised up in newness of life, we too are raised up. He was then seated at the right hand of the Father where He lives forever to make intercessions for the saints. He died, but He lives forevermore. In Revelation, He says, I am He who died, but behold, I am alive forevermore. If we died with Him, we also will live with Him forever and ever. If we endure, we will also reign with Him. The early church's strongest, finest, fullest word about what Christians ought to do is the simple little word, endure. Endure. Pretty easy to state what the gospel is. How do you know if someone has really believed it? How do you know if someone's really latched hold of it? They endure. They stay with it. They get it. They don't turn away when the going gets tough. They stick with it. I remember a Sunday night in LaPorte, Texas, in my early days of pastoring. We were doing a baptism service, and I asked 3 or 4 individuals to share their baptism testimony, their understanding of their baptism at the time they were baptized. It's kind of a scary thing to do because, we like to think we Baptists have a correct understanding of baptism, but I'm always shocked at how few Baptists seem to know what that correct understanding is. So I asked them, and I set them up for it a little bit, I suppose. I said, I don't want you to tell me what you've come to understand about baptism now that you've been a believer for 10 or 15 or 50 years. I want you to tell me, what did it mean to you? Tell the church, what did it mean to you? The time, the moment in which you were baptized. What did it mean? One of the men in our church stood up and he said, well, I was at camp such and such. We're about to go to war in Korea. He said, a chaplain came and shared the gospel with us, and I trusted Jesus as my Savior because I did not want to go to war with that hanging over my head. He said, and afterwards, the chaplain said, if you've trusted Jesus today, you ought to be baptized. He said, we marched 5 across, 20 deep, down to the pool And the chaplain baptized us. He said, to be real honest with you, it didn't mean a thing to me, except he told me it's what I was supposed to do. Well, that was honest. Another lady stood up and she said, I spent all summer at my grandmother's house, and all summer she told me about how much God loved me. And at the end of the summer, I told her I wanted to trust Jesus as my Savior. And I remember being baptized, and I remember thinking about how much God loved me. Well, that's pretty good. Another one stood up that I'd asked beforehand and said, oh, my experience was different. I went to a revival meeting. I'd never been in a church before. And man, that preacher just held me over hell like a wiener over a campfire. And I was scared to death. I went down and trusted the Lord, and I was baptized. Said, I don't remember anything about the baptism. I just remember being relieved that I could finally get off that spigot. Boy, the most interesting one I heard was a guy who's now a Baptist preacher, but he did what I asked him to do. He told the story of what his baptism meant at the time. He told about how his wife had left him, and he was driving around in Lake Charles, Louisiana with a pistol in the front seat of the car trying to work up the courage to end his life. He was going to show her. He was raised in a different denomination, not really anything. But he drove by a little church, happened to be a Baptist church. There was one car in front of the church. He said, I'm going to go in there and give that preacher one shot at me. No pun intended. He walked inside and told the preacher what he was there for, and the preacher shared Jesus with him, and he trusted Jesus as his Lord and Savior. He said, now I want you to know that night, that Sunday, I went forward, and that Sunday night I was baptized. And he said, when I came up out of that water, and that water was running off my face, it was as if every sin I'd ever committed was just being washed away from me. Is that really a good Baptist understanding of baptism? Not really. I asked the question then, what do all these baptisms have in common? One of our kids said, they were all in water. Well, yes. Yes, they were all in, or actually I think they said water. They were all in water, absolutely. They all got wet. And after that, they were kind of stumped. But you know what I think all four of them have in common? All four of them were still there. All four of them were still growing. All four of them would give that testimony a bit different if they were to tell you what they understand about it now. They've come to experience more of God's grace and understand it more fully. The point is, they have all endured. If we were to check them all at the moment they began, we might have questioned some things about their commitments. You follow it down the path of history and time a little bit, and you don't question it because you see the way that they've grown and become committed followers of Jesus Christ. If we endure, we will also reign with Him. Two closing words in here. One is disown and the other is faithless. It's almost one of these things that's a little confusing when we first read it. If we disown Him, He will also disown us. If we're faithless, He remains faithful, for He cannot ultimately disown Himself. The idea of disowning is the idea of turning your back completely on it. It's the idea of walking away from it. It's the idea of saying, not just that I don't think I believe all that anymore, it's the idea of saying Jesus isn't enough for me anymore. Jesus isn't enough for me. Paul says in another place, no man says that Jesus is Lord but by the Spirit of God. No one can make that confession but by the Spirit of God. And no one says Jesus is accursed, who is one of His. Jesus isn't enough.